Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this week's edition of Trending Treasury. This week, joined by Omar from Phi Capital. Thank you very much for joining us, Omar. How are you today?
Very well, thank you. Thanks for having me. Good to meet
you. No problem. Yeah, and today you'll be telling us about providing affordable housing solutions with income strips. Do you want to kick us off? Tell us a little bit about Phi.
Sure. So thanks very much. Just to give you a quick introduction to Phi Capital Investment. So I suppose if we can go to the first slide, please. So look, we're a long-standing impact investor, and really what we're all about is bringing more affordable housing into being. And we do that in lots of different ways. I appreciate at the moment impact investing is a bit of a buzzword, a bit trendy these days, but we've been doing it for a long time. I myself have been in this sector for nearly 20 years now, and I think, you know, as the whole evolution of impact investing is starting to bite now and be taken more seriously, we've got things like the impact reporting framework that Big Society Capital and Good Economy have just released this month, and we've adopted that and building it into our business and investment models to help facilitate more housing delivery. But I think, you know, really what we see, the way that we see ourselves, is that we are making real change in the sector, real change in the way that local authorities, particularly, also housing associations and other public sector bodies, but particularly local authorities, are able to access different streams of housing and control them to ensure that they're delivered on an affordable basis. And we do that through a number of means. Number one is technology, and I'll mention Iris a number of times. Iris is our online platform, which I'll spend half an hour talking about Iris as it is, but you know, very kind of headline. You know, what Iris does is it allows a local authority to articulate a particular brief. For example, you know, ex-local authority housing stock, 3-bedroom houses, that sort of thing. It can be as narrow or as broad as in the brief as need be. And Iris can then go and search the market. It goes and searches what's on market. We have a number of mechanisms of delivering or identifying housing that's off market as well, and bringing that to local authorities. And then through a 2-click process, a council can pick and choose which properties suit their needs. We do all the work behind the scenes and effectively hand them the keys when the property is ready for occupation. Obviously, sitting behind Iris is us as a business, Phi. You know, we're a team of 17 people. We've been working together for a long time, and you know, you know, the work that we do and how we work with local authorities using Iris particularly helps deliver that. We pride ourselves on looking at things differently and being innovative in the way that we do things, and what we're going to talk about today, income strip leasing models, you know, what they are, why, you know, how they're being used and why they're currently not being used in residential in affordable housing investment. You know, we're going to cover that, but you know, I suppose that what we've done is over the last few years we've been working with some of the bigger annuity funds around designing a mechanism, designing a model that works on a small scale, traditionally works on large scale, big investments of £20 million plus, and how we can take the benefits of that investment model and deliver it on a much smaller, granular, you know, 1-bed flat basis. But all of that, you know, we recognise that, you know, the partners we're working with, local authorities, are all they need all the flexibility and control as though the accommodation was their own. You know, where it is, what it is, to what standard it's delivered, who's going to live there, what rents are going to be charged. All of those things rest with the council throughout. We put our web address and our LinkedIn. You know, there's plenty of information on both our website, and we do post a lot of our activities on LinkedIn, so listeners can find out more about what we do and how we're doing by following those links. So just go to the next slide, please. What we've got here, just very quickly, you know, we're not all about leasing. We're not a business that's just about leasing. We are, as I said earlier, about delivering more housing, however that might be, and we work with a number of authorities, helping them acquire housing directly themselves, using their own capital, using PWLB, and using Iris and Fi to source that accommodation and deliver it for them on their balance sheet, direct into their HRA. We're just launching our first impact fund. We're just launching our first impact fund, which will be at the end of this year. That's a £50 million fund, which will be backed by local authority pension funds and other public bodies, and matched with private capital, really looking about delivering shorter term leasing models for really about improving temporary accommodation and moving people out of TA and emergency accommodation into more settled accommodation. But the other thing that we do is we do work with local authorities and institutional investors around delivering longer term reversionary leases, income strip leasing, which is what I'll go on to talk about. So next slide, please. So I thought, thought it might be good to address what is an income strip lease. I mean, it is a lease. It's a mechanism. It's a financing mechanism that really is an additional form of funding to help deliver more homes, and that's how we're working with some authorities at the moment. I mean, the elements of it, if you look at it, it's a full repairing and insuring lease that you have on a property. It's a regular lease. It's usually a long-term lease of 30 years plus. We found a 40-year lease, looking at how that works out in the financial markets. 40-year leasing works best for local authorities about driving, because it's all about driving heavily discounted rents and getting the best discount you can at 40 years works, but it can work at 30 years. You're talking about institutional landlords, institutional investors. So the big names that household names that those annuity funds, M&G, Aviva, L&G, and the like. They're the participants that are funding this sort of investment structure. As I mentioned, as a result of it being funding from those organisations, the cost of capital is hugely reduced to what you can usually achieve in the market, and therefore you are able to deliver housing at heavily discounted rents. Fundamental element of an income strip lease is that at the end of the lease, the property reverts to the tenants, to the council in this case, for £1. And so to that end, it's often, when we're explaining this model to local authorities, it's best to look at it as a repayment mortgage. Over the 40 years, you'll have bought the property effectively. That's what it is. You'll have paid your interest, you'll have paid your capital, and you'll own the property at the end of it. Now, the lease rent does go up by inflation, CPI +1 typically, and the reason for that is that those funders that I mentioned earlier that are putting in the capital to invest, what they're doing is matching their own pension liabilities, and pensions go up by inflation, and therefore they need income streams that match that and go up by inflation as well. So it's just it is a feature of an income strip lease, but there's lots of mitigations that you can build into the model to ensure that you can capture that risk element of it, and one of them is capping and collaring that inflation rate. So so that's really the elements of what makes up an income strip lease. There's a list there of I don't know, 15-20 councils that have used income strip models to invest into developments. They are they've used lots of different ways of doing it. I'll come on to explain in a minute that most income strip models to date have been into kind of commercial real estate, into regeneration, into shopping centre, high streets and shopping centres and the like. It's familiar territory for many local authorities.
Omar, can I just jump in here? What are the typical caps and collars that you have? Is it sort of collared at 0, capped at, I don't know, 4? Yeah,
so it's the answer is it's negotiable. It's what works for the local authority. I mean, typically you're looking at 0 and 5 or 1 and 4 is the typical cap and collar. But each authority, we get into the modelling, the financial modelling, and the assumptions, and with their financial teams as well, to make sure that it works for them.
Yeah, and your relationship with the likes of M&G, do they source some projects and come to you with those, or is it just a sort of needs must?
No, typically we bring the projects to them.
Right.
So we're out busy, building the relationships with the local authorities and putting together. I mean, normally, an M&G or an LNG can't really engage on a granular basis. They need that, large scale investment. We are able to do that, so we're able to kind of like fill that role and help local authorities build up their portfolio, so that it becomes something that M&G could work with.
Yeah, so you build the granular and come to them with a larger portfolio, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Okay, so question, why would a council consider using an income strip funding structure for affordable housing? Well, I think, I mean, the main point is it's just another means of creating more housing. It's another means of creating finance and investment into the sector. And again, the way that we see this is that, using an income strip lease structure is really, just another string to a bow. It's not a replacement bow. It really is just adding another mechanism to be able to deliver that housing. And so I suppose first and foremost, it brings more housing into the sector under the local authority's control is a reason why you would consider using it. The lease rents I've mentioned, I've got Homes England and MHCLG on this slide because we have been working with both organisations around looking at how we can build in grant structures to an income strip model to help create social rented accommodation as well. And they have particular programs at the moment, the rough sleeper accommodation program, that particularly lends itself well to this sort of model, because under that RSAP program, what the government are looking to do is create their national assets in perpetuity owned by the state for, potentially for future pandemics, but also to ensure that as we start to eradicate rough sleeping, that it isn't something that that starts to grow again behind the scenes. And so we've been looking at exactly how we work those models. We've run the models through both of those organisations, and as a result, have their support for joint bids with local authorities under this structure. And we're currently running that with one particular authority at the moment as we approach the next deadline, which I think is the 1st of September. So this model can work with grants, and it can, whether it's right to buy, I'll talk a bit more about that in a second, or whether it's other affordable housing grants, but they can all come into the system as almost like a co-investment to reduce the rents. Having said that, it doesn't need grant. It can work without grant and can still produce affordable housing. And the benefits there obviously is that there's no additional PWLB borrowing required. We're aware of authorities that have programs of housing delivery that they're funding through PWLB and their own reserves and in their HRA, and they might be delivering 500 new council homes over the next 2-3 years, which is fantastic, but sitting in a backlog of a need for, say, 10,000 homes, so they're only addressing a 5% of their need, and are borrowing a lot of money, albeit from central government, to deliver that 5%. Obviously there's got to be different paths to delivering the other 95%. Under this model, there is protection against future right to buy claims. Technically, sitting under a 30 or 40-year lease, the landlord is a private landlord. It is an M&G or an LNG. And therefore it doesn't qualify for right to buy claims. In 40 years' time, it may well do, but that depends on what the rules are in 40 years' time. But it does, so therefore it does protect in the mid to long term that those assets that the local authority control. From a local authority point of view, looking at this model and the way that we deploy it, it does reduce risks on abortive costs for the council. In fact, it removes them. It doesn't even reduce them, because we take on all of that risk. So up to the point of handing over the keys to the local authority to a particular property or a development, then they don't run any risk of that scheme falling away or not being delivered to their standards. We also take on any development risk and planning risk, so that all sits with us in up front. So again, not for the local authority to worry about. As I mentioned, the key feature is that all of this means that without necessarily putting in any capital, the ownership of the property comes to the local authority at the end of the lease, and so they are building up their housing stock over time as well. And obviously they're working with professional institutional landlords throughout the term. So again, it helps address some of the issues that some authorities are having with a multitude of buy-to-let investors and private rented sector. This really kind of standardizes the model, the structure, the parties that are involved, and helps deliver to a specific need of housing.
Yeah, brilliant. You touched on sort of the development risk being reduced there, and that's sort of an interesting point in that you're not comparing like for like when a local authority goes and borrows from the PWLB, but obviously it's something to consider. How does the sort of rate compare with that of the PWLB in your modelling in terms of costs?
Yeah, so this sort of structuring isn't a replacement of PWLB, and obviously neither us nor Aviva, for example, are central government, and therefore not running at the same cost of capital. The rate varies. It's anywhere from mid threes. It will depend on a number of things. It will depend on what's going on in the gilts, because all of these financial instruments are priced against gilts, so it depends what's going on with them at the time. It depends on the covenant of the local authority. Each local authority, obviously, whilst technically is backed by central government, they all have different credit ratings. It also depends on things like volume. Whilst we don't require a minimum volume, it does. Obviously, there are economies of scale, and there is an impact on what volume can do. But you're typically looking at mid threes, 3.5 to 3.75% as a cost of capital, total cost of capital, on this sort of product. But again, that's all worked out with the finance teams at the time.
Yeah, we have had a number of questions come in, so I know you're going to address some of these as we go forward, but I'll just ask one of them now. Is this repurposing of properties, existing properties, or is it focusing on new builds?
It's a mixture. Where Iris comes into its own, it works fantastically on repurposing of existing properties, so that dispersed accommodation, and that's a particular requirement under different programs of housing need, particularly under that rough sleeper accommodation program. Dispersed accommodation is the preferred requirement, and as part of that, what we do, and as part of our kind of ESG credentials as well, we aim to we're looking at that retrofitting to meet net zero carbon and increase all as many as we can. You can't do it with all, but as many as we can, bringing up EPC levels to a level C as a minimum. But having said that, we also we have got requirements for blocks of accommodation. So we still acquire new build blocks on a turnkey basis, but we work with the developers and the council right up front throughout the period, so that the development is coming through to the council specification, rather than trying to retrofit a property into a council need. So it's both is the answer. And when we come on to the example, the case study at the end, you'll see that alongside delivering 80 odd individual homes for Thurrock Council, we also have 2 blocks of new build accommodation that we're delivering under this programme.
Brilliant. Yeah, as you mentioned earlier on, sort of it's the flexibility for all sort of options there. Another question that's come in is the authority mentioned in this using this method in an HRA setting? Is that the most common setting to be in? Yes. The answer is it depends. It is to the local authority, and I suppose ultimately it depends on how they want to use the accommodation, whether they're using it as temporary accommodation or whether they're using it as long-term affordable housing, for their waiting lists. It can be either or, but I think typically it does sit within the HRA. Brilliant. And last one from the audience. Do you undertake refurbishment of the properties to bring them up to the required standard?
Yeah, so certainly we do, and we have, and again, Iris plays its part here. So Iris works with contractors and fit to let teams at local authorities, and it translates FRAs, for example, and asbestos surveys to build out the elements that need to be built into a property to create a schedule of works that gets signed off by a local authority, so that they know that they're receiving a property that meets all their required standards, but also to their finish. So we have some authorities where they don't want any white goods, for example, in the kitchen. Some that do, some that want flooring, some that don't. So each local authority can fit the standard that they require to each, almost to each property, actually. Depending on who they're renting out the property to. But we have that. We have that full kind of project management, development management program. And obviously, again, if volumes are working at the right numbers, then our focus is absolutely on working with local trades, building in apprenticeship programs and the like to help deliver that program and help kind of like that multiplier effect of social impact within a community that we're working in. So we're mindful of all those elements too. Brilliant.
Yeah, the ESG and the social impact is certainly an area that lots of local authorities are building on at the moment. So can you tell us about a bit about the barriers to sort of entry?
Sure. Well, if we just step on to the next slide, please. So, I mean, it does beg the question, as a funding model to deliver more housing, why it isn't being used more prevalently in local authorities at the moment. And I think, what we've highlighted here, I mean, the key challenge has been that really to access this level of capital, this cost of capital, has really been exclusively used for schemes that are a kind of 20 million plus investment, and which is obviously a big commitment for anybody to be looking at. But it also removes the flexibility of being able to look at a program of housing that might be needed. Say, we're dealing with one authority at the moment that's looking for 4 or 5 bedroom houses to be used as for their children's services, for looked after children, to and it's a very particular type of property, but they only need 3 of them. And that's where the benefit comes in. Is what would ordinarily preclude them from being able to apply this model, because that might be a total value of say £1 million, and it's not enough to bring in an annuity fund on that sort of level. One of the other challenges has been that obviously at that size of investment, £20 million, you're normally talking about large estates of development, which may be 2 or 5 years in the future. Obviously, we need all of those schemes coming, those pipelines. We still need those, but that doesn't address the needs of the next 6 months, the next 12 months, and that's and again, that's really what we're trying to address here. On a smaller scale, immediacy, fixing some other problems that future pipeline is not going to be able to fix right now. And I think the other point is that traditionally, as I mentioned earlier, it's really big, and again, it comes as big with the ticket value, 20 million plus. Then you're generally looking at large regeneration. You're looking at high street investments. You're looking at large commercial properties. It might even be council properties, new council offices and the like. But it might be offices. It could be whatever it might be. And so I think traditionally, this sort of level of investment has been parked outside of housing because it's kind of too big and too difficult to fit. But that's really where we have been. That's what we've really been focused on trying to address. And we're doing that through Iris. We're doing that by working directly with those annuity funds and creating a bit more innovation, taking on the workload ourselves, absorbing it into Iris and our processes. So as a result, we don't need a minimum volume. Plenty of authorities we talk to want to try it out and do 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 properties. They don't want to commit to necessarily a long-term program, and that's fine. We can work with them on that basis. As I said before, the fact that it can be used for dispersed accommodation or developments, that helps. We don't have procurement issues. We always have procurement conversations, but we're not being procured for anything. And really, the key point is that at the end of the day, there is everything is available, 100% transparency on cost, 100% transparency on data that's collected on each property, and all the while the council retain full control over those properties.
Brilliant. And it's that flexibility that's sort of key to everything here, and in order to match the income strip side of things, presumably the rents that the council charge that they have control in setting will have to go up in line with sort of their costs as well, for this to sort of stay worth it.
Exactly, and that's why the kind of headroom that's built in, the gross to net, between the lease rent and the LHA rent. Say, if we go to the next slide, you'll see an example of what we've been doing with Thurrock this last 6 months. So all those properties on the left are all properties that we've bought for them. So we've over the last 6 months bought them 115 properties. Buying them and have bought them. Of those 115, we've already gone through a whole refurbishment program and leased them 42. We've got another 15 or so coming to them over the next couple of weeks. The two developments that I mentioned earlier, pictured there down the bottom right, so two larger developments, a block of 11, a block of 16, and 31 that's currently going through the process now. So with all of that, what you can see there is that the average lease against this whole portfolio property is about 45% of the market rent, 55% of LHA, and so that builds in a headroom. And in that headroom, we can build in all the life cycle assumptions that are going to need to be sinking funds, voids, repairs and maintenance programs, indexation. All of those things need to be accounted for as well. So we do, and again work very closely with their finance teams to make sure that it works for them. Because if you go back to that very first slide, don't go back to it, but if that circle that we had, that balance between financial return, social impact, and risk share, those three things have got to work in tandem. Otherwise, it doesn't work.
Brilliant. We have had a few more questions come in, and one of them is a clarification. Sort of, if it sits within the HRA, how are the properties not impacted by the right to buy? Presumably that's because it's not owned by the council until the end of the
correct, yeah,
strip. Yeah,
that's and again, I mean, worth saying that we have worked with Trowers on the creation of all of this structure. So obviously they've well experts in this field around procurement and right to buy, and so we've gone to some extreme lengths to ensure that the product is robust in that respect.
Brilliant. And another one, has there been an example where developer and LA work together on a large site to get scale benefits? You talked about those economies of scale earlier, so have you worked on those?
So we have worked on them with councils, more in a kind of like a vetting a process, checking the financial viability. We haven't delivered them ourselves. So the largest scheme that we will have delivered is the one down there on the bottom right, which is a 16-unit new build. But we are working with one London borough at the moment that have asked us to identify specifically large blocks of between 20 and 60 units. So it absolutely can be applied to that larger scale, and therefore get that economy of scale, particularly the rental discounts as well. But to date, 16 in a new block is where we've got to.
Brilliant. And the last one, the professional landlord service. What are the key responsibilities and benefits there?
So I think that having a professional landlord, I presume that the question is asking about like having an institutional landlord there. What's the benefits of that? Obviously, you have a standardised leasing structure. So across these 80 odd properties that you can see on this screen here, it's one lease. Well, it's one lease per property, but it's an identical lease throughout. The administration of making sure all the rent dates, payments are all aligned, making sure that the rent reviews are all aligned, all of that sort of thing. So you have a landlord who is answerable and has their own social impact agendas, have their own reasons to be working in partnership with these local authorities, but also that you know that the quality of the property that's being delivered to you up front is going to meet your standards anyway. So you're going to avoid any of that substandard accommodation that we read about in the press, particularly around TA, around temporary accommodation. You know that what's coming through is going to fully comply with all regulations. It's, you know, it's professional. It's a professional service.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Omar. It's been quite informative, really. And so thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Next week, Joe, if you could go on to the next slide, please. Next week, we have the Prudential Code consultation update. So for any local authorities on the call at the moment, please join us next week for that. And any non-local authorities, we have a full lineup in the weeks ahead. So please join us for those as well. Once again, Omar, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks very much.
And thank you all for joining us as well. Till next week. Bye.